Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea's closer military ties with Russia are reigniting the debate over South Korea's nuclear armament. Today we discuss the security environment around the peninsula and options for the US-ROK alliance.
기만과 과장을 위한 수단에 불과하다고 생각합니다.
확고한 대비 태세를 유지하고 북한의 도발에 압도적으로 단호하게 대응할 것입니다.
We just have to be purposeful on following through with the specific steps in the declaration.
In the studio with me, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman served as Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security until 2017. He returned to the State Department as a Senior Advisor for International Security and Non-Proliferation until 2022. Also joining us, Mr. Robert Peters, the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Peters served as the lead strategist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He was also the Special Advisor for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Peters, North Korea tested ballistic missile after few rounds of trash balloon launches. And what will be North Korea's next steps, especially after the defense security agreement with Russia? Will we see more provocative actions from North Korea?
Well, they've got a lot of options. As we've seen over recent months, North Korea has stepped up both its ballistic missile tests and its cruise missile tests. I think it's possible that we could see additional tests in the future, particularly longer range tests of its ballistic missile capabilities, potentially out of the Central Pacific. But I think also we should be prepared for potential tests of multiple independent reentry vehicles. Even though the test probably was a failure earlier this week, it's clear that North Korea is interested in continuing to develop these capabilities, and so we should be prepared for an attempt of North Korea to employ or at least test multiple independent reentry vehicles.
So we'll talk about more a little bit later. Mr. Countryman, for the first time in 7 years, South Korea conducted live fire drills near its maritime border with North Korea, and US's F-22 Raptor flew to the Korean peninsula. But some people are skeptical that the show of force will deter North Korea's provocations. Do you think US and South Korea should step up its military reaction to North Korean provocations, or just manage the tensions to avoid limited conflict?
There are three reasons for doing military drills. One is to prepare for Korean-American cooperation in the case of a military conflict. Second is to deter the adversary. And third is to reassure the public that the military is prepared. The first one is the most important, to actually exercise the military capabilities that might be needed. And that is what the US and the ROK should continue to focus on. I don't think that a radical change in direction of the exercises, either to step them up or to step them down, is going to make a difference. When Mr. Kim wants to see a provocation, he will see one.
Mr. Peters, North Korea have claimed to successfully completed multi-warhead separation and guidance control. It is the first known show of multi-warhead missile launch. Now, North Korea refuted South Korea's claim that North Korea has failed in its hypersonic missile launch. Which side makes more sense to you?
I think from the videos that we've seen, the South Korean narrative is probably closer to the truth than the North Korean narrative. That said, every test, even one that's a failure in which a missile breaks up upon launch, gives important and valuable data to the tester. So North Korea, even if it was an unsuccessful launch, probably got some important telemetric data from the breakup. That said, I think North Korea is trying to telegraph to the ROC and to the United States that they are interested in developing and potentially fielding MIRV capabilities to increase their ability to target both ROC and also American sites.
So how sophisticated is MIRV technology, and what kind of threat does that pose to South Korea? And also the hypersonic missiles, what kind of threat does that pose to South Korea?
So first of all missiles, not all, but most missiles are hypersonic. Ballistic missiles, ICBMs, those go above Mach 5, which is kind of the threshold for what constitutes hypersonic. MIRV, that technology has been around for almost half a century now, first in the United States and then in the Soviet Union. And those are real threats. We should not try to dismiss those threats. That said, it doesn't, in my mind, fundamentally alter the threat characterization of North Korea. They have nuclear capabilities. They have a maturing ballistic missile and an increasingly capable cruise missile capability. Their ability to mate those weapons is at this point unclear, but we need to be prepared for a North Korea that is continually and slowly but steadily improving its capabilities to hold targets at risk in both South Korea and the United States.
With the revived DPRK-Russia Mutual Defense Treaty, some say that U.S., South Korea, and Japan should also upgrade their relationship to a trilateral alliance. Do you think they should go beyond the current level of information sharing and drills together? We just had Freedom Edge exercises this week.
Yeah, so as I've said before, I fully support things like the data sharing for missile defense. Most of that right now is post-launch data sharing. I would like to see pre-launch data sharing between the United States, South Korea, and Japan when it comes to missile defenses. I think that would make the systems of all three nations more effective and therefore more credible as a deterrent to any kind of North Korean aggression. I do support further exercises. I think Mr. Countryman laid it out as to what the benefits of exercises and why you do it. And I think adding Japan into that mix would only strengthen all three pieces. I mean, I do think it's time for the democracies in East Asia and the United States to work together to demonstrate and provide a cohesive front that's opposed to the actions coming out of Pyongyang and increasingly out of Moscow and Beijing.
Mr. Countryman, should the three countries consider something like NATO in Asia?
At some point, they should consider it. What I would recommend is that at the moment, they focus on strengthening that cooperation and communication among the three. And if they do that, then I think as a natural outgrowth, there could be an alliance in the future. Of course, it would be important to emphasize that just as NATO is, this would be a defensive alliance for protection of the three, not for any kind of aggression.
And if I can just add to that, I think that's exactly right. And NATO includes a secretariat and international staff and a pretty sizable bureaucracy that can at times be cumbersome. I don't think that's necessary between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. I think if you have an effective, credible defensive alliance that had militaries that were largely interoperable and highly capable, that would go very far to deterring the aggression that we're also concerned about.
And the U.S. and Japan are currently considering upgrading the commander in Japan to a more senior level, and I think they're just on their way doing what you've just said. Mr. Countryman, Putin agreed with Kim Jong-un to seek civilian nuclear cooperation, effectively giving a nod to North Korea's nuclear development out of the NPT, and some observers say that the latest development could further fuel South Korea's nuclear drive. And growing number of former U.S. government officials and experts are open to this idea. Do you think that South Korea, surrounded by nuclear powers of China, Russia, and North Korea, would it be difficult to suppress South Korea's nuclear desire?
Well, whether you're talking about an individual or a country, everybody has desires. It's not easy to suppress desires and temptations, but it is possible to resist the temptation to do something self-destructive. And for South Korea to pursue nuclear weapons is not cost-free. It doesn't add to their current defense capabilities. It would radically change those defense capabilities. Nobody could assume that leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty would not damage the relationship, economic and political, that the ROK enjoys, the prestige it enjoys now. No one should assume that it would leave the US-ROK alliance unchanged if the ROK seeks to provide its own defense and not rely on the United States. And nobody should assume that the ROK would be immune from the kind of ostracism that the DPRK and Iran have suffered. So it's a bad idea. I understand the desire. I understand when it's political season and politicians like to talk tough. But to stop and ask what are the real world consequences of leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty and going into a nuclear weapons program, I think more rational minds would realize that's not the answer.
Both of you were in the U.S. government for a long time. Do you agree with the view that South Korea's nuclear development will lead to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea? And would that be in U.S. interest in the region?
You know, it's hard to say. It's hard to predict the future, of course, and that's a decision that a future president would make if South Korea went down that route. I mean, what I'd say, and as I've said before in this program, I'm open to the reintroduction of American nuclear weapons onto the South Korean peninsula and changing the decisions that we made at the end of the Cold War, in which we removed nuclear weapons from the South Korean peninsula. And I'm even open to the type of nuclear burden sharing that we see in NATO taking place in South Korea. That is, South Korean pilots piloting South Korean aircraft that are capable of employing American nuclear weapons. I look at a deteriorating security situation in Northeast Asia. I see a steadily increasing and maturing nuclear power in North Korea. And let's not forget, the fastest growing nuclear power on the planet is China. We have a problem when it comes to deterrence, particularly in Northeast Asia. I don't want to go down this route, but if it comes to trying to reestablish a modicum of stability within the region, I'm open to that idea. And what does that mean? How do you not only assure South Korea, but deter aggression in North Korea and China? And as I said before, I'm not pro South Korea getting its own nuclear weapon. I want to see a number of steps take place before we get there. That said, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is not a suicide pact. If the difference is selective allied proliferation, which the United States has accepted in the past during the Cold War, or making it more likely to see theater nuclear war, then we have to make some hard decisions. And I mean, we're at a point now where there are only bad choices before us, and we have to identify what are the least worst options available to both the United States and to South Korea in order to ensure that stability is maintained.
So I've agreed with Mr. Peters on almost everything we've said so far, but on this point I have a different point of view. First, historically, since the introduction and the entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, we have not tolerated allies going down this route. Second, you can look to NATO for various kinds of precedents. But I start with where I started talking about military exercises, and that is, it should have military utility. Very few people believe that the NATO nuclear sharing arrangement has real military utility. It is primarily a political signal that reassures people about U.S. commitment, and it's too bureaucratically difficult to change that in NATO. There could be an argument for reintroducing U.S. nuclear weapons to the peninsula based both on military need, but probably based on the need to reassure the South Korean public. That's not the best reason to make such a precipitous move.
If I could,
Yeah.
the reason why the NATO nuclear component is seen as a political tool as opposed to a military weapon, I would submit, is because we have so drawn down our forces within Europe when it comes to the nuclear arsenal that it is less than a shadow of where it was in 1970. That's not to say which is not to say that I want to go back to the force levels that we had in 1970 for the arsenal, But the reason why it only has political utility is because it's so small that it has no military utility. If you were to increase our capabilities in Europe, when you're talking about America's extended deterrent commitments and the forces in theater, the number of nuclear warheads in Europe, then it could have military utility and it could be an effective and credible deterrent capability.
We could have a long discussion
Yes,
about
we
Europe, but we came here to talk about Asia.
Right, and what about the possibility of having a latent nuclear capability? Japan has a civilian nuclear arrangement with the United States to reprocess spent fuel rods and enrich uranium. Some South Korean experts say that South Korea should also have that capability. So when the time comes that South Korea really needs to get the nuclear weapon, they can get it quickly.
I spent more than 2 years leading the negotiation of the 123 agreement, the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with Seoul, and that was not an objective that was expressed by the ROK, the idea of having weapons latency. It was expressed more as a desire to be treated exactly the same as Japan, and I understand the political imperative there as well. But the way I look at it, either you trust the United States to back up South Korea as it has for 74 years, or you don't. And if you trust, then a true political leader reassures his people that the agreements he's made in Washington are adequate for national security. If the leadership in the ROK doubts that and conveys that doubt to the public, then we have a situation in which the defense of the ROK is being undermined.
That leadership, Mr. Peters, potential running for that party leader of the ruling party in Korea, said that when she becomes the leader, she will have a party policy to pursue nuclear weapons. And another senior politician said that U.S. will not trade New York for Seoul, and this argument is gaining momentum. Some are even proposing, as you alluded to, some of the examples in NATO. De Gaulle came out of NATO, got his own nuclear weapons, and went back to NATO, and South Korea should follow that footsteps. No matter how strong the U.S. extended deterrence is, given the security environment around Korean Peninsula, wouldn't it eventually lead South Korea to go nuclear? And suppressing that kind of sentiment, ongoing sentiment, another survey out this week that 67% of Koreans want nuclear weapons. Wouldn't that harm U.S.-Korea relationship?
Look, as I've said, I am not, at this point, a believer that South Korea should have its own independent arsenal. I don't believe that we're at that juncture, which is why I do support the reintroduction of American nuclear weapons into South Korea, in part to deter, but in part to assure the South Korean polity and the leadership so that they do not need to go down that route. Because I do see nuclear weapons as just as much political weapons as military warfighting weapons, but you cannot ignore the political aspect of that. So if the reintroduction of American nuclear weapons onto the peninsula, even if they're only able to be employed by Americans flying American aircraft, is able to stave off an independent South Korean bomb, I'm willing to go down that route.
First, just make a point about the opinion survey. I'll look carefully at the opinion survey and the way they ask the question. There's good reason to be skeptical about public opinion polls and what they are designed to demonstrate. But if the question is, would you like to have nuclear weapons? That's like asking me, would I like to have a new Italian sports car? The answer is yes. If the question is, would you like to have a new Italian sports car if it means giving up your house? The answer is no. I'd like to see a survey that asks people, would you like to see the ROK build nuclear weapons if it means a radical change in the relationship with the US and the rest of the world? Or even more provocatively, would you like to have nuclear weapons if it means being treated as a pariah like North Korea or Iran? That's the question, not what would I like to have under the Christmas tree this year.
So if I may, so the pariah status of Iran and North Korea is not solely due to their nuclear program.
Correct.
It is because of the nature of the regimes in Tehran and Pyongyang. And I don't think, and I recognize that you're not equivocating between the regimes in Seoul and Pyongyang and Tehran, but you cannot equate the consequences of South Korea getting its own nuclear weapon, which again, I don't support at this juncture, with Pyongyang or Tehran going down that route.
No, I agree. And that's why I said it would be a provocative question. But there would, without doubt, be a change in Seoul's relationship with the rest of the world.
But what about the cases of Israel or France, like allies, U.S. allies who had that nuclear weapons but still maintains good relationship?
They had those weapons prior to the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. South Korea has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has agreed again in a commitment between two presidents to respect the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think if you have just made a promise to do something, to turn around in less than a year and start talking about, well, I might change my mind, it calls into question the reliability of the partnership.
And Mr. Countryman, wouldn't South Korea's demand for and warning of and raising the possibility of nuclear weapons and not actually getting that weapon serve to put the brakes to Russia and China's unlimited support to North Korea?
No, it would not.
Because of the nature of Russia and China?
Well, mainly because of the nature of Russia and China. And I think that the ROK is an extremely important country worldwide. However, I don't believe that either President Putin or President Xi are primarily thinking about Seoul when they make their provocative moves or build arsenals. They are thinking about Washington and NATO more than Seoul.
China, more than anything, China's top priority is regional stability. So even to its ally North Korea, China opposed North Korea getting its nuclear development because China wants regional stability. And if South Korea gets nuclear weapons, that would seriously irk China.
I disagree with your statement of China's primary interest. China wants regional stability on its own terms. And that might mean going to military action to retake Taiwan, which is not in anybody's interest. I see China's primary concern to be victory in what they believe to be the inevitable surpassing of the United States and China to be the world's greatest power. That's the primary concern of China. And in terms of, yes, you're correct, and I've discussed this many times with Chinese friends in government and out, China does not want to see North Korea have nuclear weapons. What have they done about it? Not a goddamn thing. In fact, they see the problem of North Korea the way they see every other issue. It is a subset of the US-China relationship, which is the only foreign policy issue in Beijing.
Right. But if South Korea gets its nuclear weapons, that could be a nuclear domino in Northeast Asia where Japan and even Taiwan, which attempted previously to get nuclear weapons, and if Taiwan gets nuclear weapons, that would seriously impact China.
Well, that should be part of the opinion survey in the ROK. Should ROK get nuclear weapons if it means Japan and Taiwan will also build nuclear weapons? It's a good question to ask.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Peters, Mr. Countryman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.